Luna here, and today we're going to find out, can you beat Dragonage Origins with the fewest companions possible? This run was suggested by Joshua Brock 2242, and I've interpreted it as a main character solo run. Let's go over the rules. We must avoid having party members whenever possible. Non-party member allies are allowed. Any companions the game forces us to take along must do the bare minimum. We'll set their tactics to passive, we will not assign their attribute, skill, or talent points, and we will remove their equipment. They cannot perform actions like crafting, lockpicking, or disarming traps. We'll avoid recruiting optional companions. However, we don't have to remove the ones we're saddled with, as lowering their approval enough to drive them away might require us to have them in the party so they can watch us do things they hate. If an optional quest requires us to take companions along, it must be skipped. No glitches or gameplay mods. Official DLC is allowed, but I only own the Stone Prisoner DLC on this account, so assume most DLC items are unavailable to us. We won't be covering the story or companion conversations in depth during this run. There's simply too much to fit in one video. However, the main quests will be discussed briefly because some quest decisions affect the challenge, so spoiler warnings and all that. Also, this game gets pretty dark. We won't be covering much in detail. I flat out cut a couple scenes and lines, but you've been warned. All of the origins have temporary companions. The human noble, Mage, and dwarven noble have 3 each, while the city elf and dwarf commoner have only 1 each. Dalish elves can have 3, but only force us to take 2. The strictest interpretation of the rules would force us to play a dwarf commoner or city elf, but I didn't want to lock out most origins, humans, and mages over characters we will never have in our party again, with one exception. Human nobles start with Dog, a Mabari warhound. As much as I love Dog, he is an optional companion for all other origins, so we must pick a different origin and we can't help Dog in Ostagar. This may be the hardest part of the challenge for me. Look at his adorable little face, and we have to leave him to a horrible fate. We're playing a mage, so only the Magi origin is open to us, and we pick elf for more magic and willpower. I'm not certain which specializations we'll take. Shapeshifter and Arcane Warrior are looking the best to me because they'll make us tougher, but taking both of them might be redundant. Blood magic could be useful, but burning health to cast spells might not end well, especially since it also imposes a penalty on most forms of healing. We won't be able to use blood sacrifice to get around that penalty. Even if we have an ally, using them that way would be against the challenge rules. Spirit Healer is one of my favorite specializations normally, but most of its spells are meant to affect the entire party, so it's probably not going to be very useful here. We're starting the challenge on Nightmare. It isn't a failure if we drop the difficulty, but I want to at least try. While we can raise the difficulty after lowering it, it'll be easier to follow along if I say, here's where we decrease the difficulty, and you can all safely assume that's where the difficulty is until and unless we have to decrease it again. Casual massively boosts our healing, resistances, attack, defense, and damage while reducing the enemy's damage resistances. Normal removes our bonus resistances and healing, and removes enemies' resistance penalties, but it still gives us smaller bonuses to attack, defense, and damage. Hard removes those bonuses, reduces our healing, and gives enemies more resistances and their full AI. Nightmare reduces our resistances and increases the enemy's resistances further. Attack determines our chance to hit, but since it doesn't affect spells or staves, it won't be important to us. Defense helps us avoid attacks. Damage resistances are straightforward. Enemies take less damage on higher difficulties, and we'll take more. Hard and Nightmare also give enemies extra spell resistance. According to the wiki, Nightmare gives them 5%, but to me it felt higher because Bandits and Loathering resisted multiple spells in a row, meaning they completely ignored the spells. Higher difficulties may increase enemies' physical and mental resistances, which make our crowd control effects like stun and freeze less likely to work. The difficulty and enemy rank also affects the duration of crowd control effects. Our origin goes smoothly. At first, I assumed the tactics of temporary companions couldn't be set because I couldn't find the menu, and Mouse did get a few basic attacks against the Rage Demon in the Fade, but he was taken out very quickly, so I don't think he affected the fight much. We were also on fire at the end of the fight, and apparently no one put us out because we were still on fire when we woke up. By the time Lily and Jowan joined us, we'd found the tactics menu and set them to wait under all circumstances so they wouldn't attack. We also had them hold position and tried to leave them behind, but they joined us during cutscenes, and if a fight started afterwards, we had no time to move them away. This caused them to be targeted by enemies a couple times, so they were slightly useful as meat shields. We tried to get the enemy's attention, and for what it's worth, Jowan and Lily aren't tanks, so they didn't last long. Once we're able to control who's in our party, this will be a thing of the past. But until then, there's only so much we can do to keep enemies from attacking them. At least we kept them from dealing damage. Once Duncan tossed us into the Kokari Wilds, we learned our best bet was to pull 1 or 2 enemies away from groups. Against most enemies, we could easily win one-on-one by using Winter's Grasp to freeze them, or Stone Fist to knock them down. But we don't have Cone of Cold yet, so we struggled against multiple enemies. Mind Blast gave us an oh crap button, but it has a long cooldown. Drain Life was essential. It heals us, damages an enemy, and has a very fast casting time. There were a few fights where it finished an enemy off right before they would have taken us out, and other spells wouldn't have been fast enough to save us. We also tried Rock Armor, a sustained spell that increases our armor at the cost of reducing our maximum mana and making spells slightly more costly to cast. It doesn't give us enough protection to be worth using all the time, but if we're about to be swarmed, it might be worthwhile. I'm not going to cover every fight, but there were a couple notable ones like the Genlock rogues that ambushed us. Mind Blast bought us a few seconds, but we were out of mana by the time we got through a couple of them, and they could deal tons of damage fast. It didn't help that they had bows, so running only got us riddled with arrows unless we ducked behind a bank, pillar, or tree. There was also Gazareth, a shade summoned by spreading ashes over a certain spot. We could barely out-heal his attacks with Drain Life as long as we ran while Drain Life was on cooldown, but if Gazareth used his Flame Blast, it would deal way more damage than we could heal without potions. After a few tries, we beat him by chugging Lyrium potions and spamming Winter's Grasp and Stone Fist. While the freeze and knockdown effects didn't last long and some were resisted, the Lyrium allowed us to take Gazareth out before it used Flame Blast too many times. Alistair got a bit toasty because the game brought the meat shields to us before the fight, but that was the only time they were targeted by Gazareth. Other than that, and getting chewed on by wolves when we entered the area, the 3 meat shields weren't involved in combat at all. We took a set of Chantry robes from Lily that somehow fit Alistair, and he's the only permanent companion, so we put them on him. The other 2 kept their body armor because I didn't want YouTube to freak out, but they lost their other equipment and we set their tactics to wait. Fighting our way up the Tower of Ashal was difficult. The smaller interior spaces made it harder to avoid alerting groups of enemies, but we also had more cover against archers, so it wasn't all bad. We set the tactics of our 2 new generic meat shields to wait, and removed all their equipment except body armor, but due to the smaller quarters, they were targeted several times. I'm sure many of you are eager to hear about the Ogre, the first boss at the top of the tower, and if you're here to see me suffer, then enjoy, because it was an absolute nightmare. If it grabbed us, that was it, because our companions weren't allowed to free us. Due to the lengthy nature of the fight, the ogre eventually targeted our meat shields no matter what we did, so they did buy us a little time. The ogre resisted a lot of our spells, and even when we got through, it often ignored the crowd control, or it lasted for so little time it barely mattered. If we consistently got the blink and you'll miss it freeze from Winter's Grasp, we could kite the ogre, but every time the freeze didn't work for any reason, we took a ton of damage. It took several tries, and we burned through most of our potions, including the ones we made with our herbalism skill during the fight, but we took out the ogre. That victory didn't last long. After several cutscenes, we were plastered by bandits in Lothering. Good news, we saved after we fought the ogre. Bad news, we just got creamed by bandits because they resisted so many spells. We had to run into Lothering to beat them, which really confused the game. The conversation where Alistair gives directions started in the middle of the fight, and it wasn't the only one. The game registered that we weren't robbed by the bandits, but not that we took them out after leading them on a merry chase around town. Afterwards, we could finally change our party, so we sent Morrigan and Alistair to the camp, where they'll remain for the rest of the game. Leliana helped us against soldiers in the tavern. She's not in the party during this fight, so we couldn't prevent her from helping. We told her to get lost afterwards. We tried to fight bandits outside the village, but we had trouble with their spell resistance too. I was sick of save scumming until our spells worked on bandits, so we dropped the difficulty to hard. Our spells were still resisted sometimes, but they were far more reliable and our crowd control lasted longer. We've invested our attributes in magic, willpower, and constitution. Maybe if we'd focused more on magic, we'd have gotten through their spell resistance more often on Nightmare, but we also would have had less health and mana, and we're struggling with those too. I did some research on skills and spells at this point in the playthrough. I also looked into the difficulties and derived attributes like spell power. To be clear, I am not an expert at this game. I'm mostly looking at the wiki and I have no idea how accurate it is. I've seen posts conflicting with the wiki on several things, like whether spell power helps bypass spell resistance or not. First, skills. Characters get 2 pre-assigned skill points based on their class and race, with an additional point they can put wherever they want. Mages gain 1 skill point every 3 levels. We can't get XP from disarming traps or picking locks, and we don't get bonus XP for leaving the party behind, so I'm expecting us to get to about level 18, meaning we'll get 6 skill points by leveling. We'll also have access to 3 skill tomes for a total of 12 points. Sadly, mages are stuck with a rank of combat tactics, which is useless because we're directly controlling our character. Our second free point is in herbalism, which we'll need because we're chugging potions. Combat training isn't as critical for mages as it is for warriors and rogues, but rank 2 increases mana regen. We also want coercion. Since we aren't investing much in cunning or strength, we'll need all 4 ranks to pass the hardest speech checks. The first rank of poison making would let us use any poisons we find or buy. Stealing could get us extra loot, but only if we invest in cunning, which we aren't likely to do. However, the random encounters from being caught would grant XP, so if we have a skill point kicking around, we might fail at stealing if it'll get us an extra level. Trap making might be useful for setting traps, but according to the wiki, it doesn't increase trap detection range, and even if it did, only rogues can disarm traps. Survival grants nature and physical resistances, and I've already covered why we don't need combat tactics. Of our 11 useful skill points, we want 2 herbalism, 4 coercion, and 2 combat training, leaving 3 points left over. To be honest, I'm glad we have some wiggle room because we may not get all those points if we don't make it to level 18 or miss a skill tome. For spells, my plans are less concrete. Obviously, AoE spells are helpful, especially ones with crowd control like Cone of Cold. Heal would be nice to have, but we can't cast Rejuvenation on ourselves, so we're unlikely to invest further in that line of spells. Arcane Shield would help us dodge, especially if we combine it with Heroic Defense or Glyph of Warding, but that requires a lot of mana and several spell points. We tested Spell Bloom and barely noticed the increased mana regeneration. I suspect it's meant for parties that have multiple mages to benefit from it, so we took a different spell. Mana Drain would be useful against enemy spellcasters, and it leads to Spell Might. While Spell Might strains our mana too much to have up all the time, it can be used to make toggleable or long-lasting spells more powerful because they're based on our spell power at the moment they're cast and retain Spell Might's boost even if Spell Might is turned off afterwards. Weakness isn't great, but the paralysis spells it leads to are good. Vulnerability and Affliction hexes lower damage resistances. The Misdirection hex makes enemies far more likely to miss us, and may be a good alternative to investing in Arcane Shield, Heroic Defense, and Glyph of Warding against single enemies, but the defense buffs would be better against groups. Horror and Sleep can combine for an effect called Nightmare, but most bosses are immune to sleep, so it may not be a good investment considering we already want more spells than we could ever obtain, especially by only level 18 or so. To be honest, that's locking out a lot of useful but situational spells like Dispel and Force Field. We complete the Chanter's Board quests before we leave Lothering and help Elder Miriam by making health poultices. However, we cannot complete Biram or Alison's quests because we don't have poison or trap making. After we save Bodane and Sandal, we head to our camp for the first time. Feels dreadfully empty without the pupper, but such is the nature of this run. We won't have many conversations with companions, and learning specializations from them isn't allowed. Thankfully, specializations can be unlocked by other means, but we won't have easy access to Shapeshifter from Morrigan. Bodane, however, is not a companion, so he's allowed to be useful, and we've been saving for an important purchase. Bodane's inventory will reset after we leave camp the first time, and only the first time, allowing us to acquire duplicates of items that are otherwise unique. We want to buy a Tome of Arcane Technique so we can buy a second one from him later. This may be considered an exploit because the devs may not have intended for us to be able to buy multiple tomes this way, but I'm okay with it because we have to pay for both tomes, and we had to scrimp and save to buy the first tome here before it disappeared forever. To me, that makes it as valid as befriending the Dalish so we can purchase items from Verathorn later, but I figured it was worth covering so you all knew how we got the extra Tome of Arcane Technique. To be clear, we will not use the item duplication glitch to get more tomes. Now what? We only have rank 2 coercion, which limits us. There are difficult speech checks that we'll need to pass during the Nature of the Beast and Arl of Redcliffe quests. Granted, we could complete most of those quests and then leave until we can pass the checks. A paragon of her kind doesn't have any hard speech checks we need to pass, as far as I can remember. The Broken Circle needs to be completed before we can finish things in Redcliffe, but I'd like to have Mana Clash first, and once we enter the Circle Tower, we're stuck there. I decided we'd be better off heading to Denerim to start side quests. The Blackstone Irregulars, Guard Captain, Mages Collective, Chanter's Board, and interested parties all have things for us to do. Some of them don't require combat, but we have to face thugs for the Guard Captain. We can split the first group up by luring them around a gate, but the other two groups aren't as easy to deal with. We only beat the second group because their leader got very confused when we ran underneath these stairs, and he couldn't hit us with most of his attacks, while we were able to use Drain Life on him. We took out most of the third group by funneling them into this corner and using Cone of Cold, Grease, and Earthquake, but towards the end we somehow warped to the top of this tower. We were able to do this repeatedly, but only while there were enemies around. The blood mages in the deserted building were an absolute nightmare. One fireball and we were toast. Mana Clash would have helped a lot. We ran away after triggering the cutscene with their leader and then doubled back so we could start the fight with Earthquake and Grease, but their leader was difficult even one-on-one. We separated him from his minions, and after several tries, Cone of Cold, Winter's Grasp, Drain Life, and a Grease Fire took him out with the help of some potions. The Wonders of Theda's shop has a ton of stuff, including the Winter's Breath staff, a couple sets of robes, and a Ring of Ages that would significantly boost our damage resistances. They also have a Tome of Arcane Technique that we can barely afford, along with the Archivist's Belt, which will give us extra experience for new codex entries. We also ran into a traveling merchant, Old Tegrin, who had a skill tome. Sadly, we don't have enough cunning for the next rank of coercion, so we took a rank of combat training instead. Our next level will grant us a skill point and attribute points to raise our cunning and get rank 3 coercion, which should be enough to start the main quests. Another thing turned up while I was reading the wiki. Dragonage Origins has level scaling. Full disclosure, I do not like how many games implement level scaling. If everything scales with us forever, then it never feels like we're getting stronger, which reduces the incentive to level up. For me, this removes a lot of the fun and the sense of progression. However, in Dragon Age Origins, areas have level ranges, and areas have a maximum level, ranging from 11 in Redcliffe to 16 in Denerim and Orzammar. Level scaling does make balancing easier, especially for non-linear games, so I understand why devs use it, and the way Dragon Age Origins implements it is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to do it. It smooths out the difficulty, but still allows us to be outmatched early on and feel powerful later instead of feeling like we're on a difficulty treadmill. Diablo 4. The fact I never realized Dragon Age Origins had level scaling means they did it right. One post said the level scaling can be manipulated by visiting each area early so they're set to their minimum levels. However, another post said that visiting the entrance won't set the level for the entire area. For example, entering the Frostback Mountains won't set the level for Orzammar or the Deep Roads. I was relieved when I read that, and I hope it's right, because I don't want our wandering for side quests to have set areas to their lowest levels. So far, we've visited Denerim, the Calenhad Docks, and the Frostback Mountains, but we have not entered the Circle Tower or Orzammar. At this point, we can't complete any quests without at least starting a main quest. Several quests require us to speak to people in Redcliffe, and once we're there, we need to defend the village before we leave, or Redcliffe will be destroyed. However, even though the game suggests there's urgency afterward, there isn't actually a time limit. So if we can get through the village defense, we'll be able to do other stuff. Besides Redcliffe, our options are the Brazilian Forest, but I want Mana Clash before the end of that area, the Circle Tower, but I want Mana Clash before that too, or Orzammar, but we're not quite level 10, so everything there will outlevel us. Maybe I should have prioritized getting Mana Clash sooner, but we've needed all our spells to get this far, so we were in for a rough time either way. If we can scrape together enough gold, we can purchase the second Tome of Arcane Technique from Bowden, and the Quartermaster in the Circle Tower has the last one, so we only need 2 levels to get Mana Clash if we can buy those. Since several side quests require us to go to Redcliffe and defending the village will be a good source of XP, we head there next. We'll need all the help we can get during the defense, So we convinced the smith to repair the militia's equipment by agreeing to find his daughter, intimidate the local dwarf and his thugs into joining the battle, and get the local priestess to give holy symbols to the knights. The symbols won't do anything, they don't even raise the knights' morale due to a bug, but it gives us XP. We didn't go to the tavern because I didn't know the tavern existed until I read the wiki afterwards. We passed the speech check with Murdoch to raise the militia's morale, so the ale was unnecessary, but we could have convinced the barkeep to fight. We did find oil in the ruined general store and used it to set a fire trap on the path to the castle. I wish we could have set fire traps near the chantry instead, because the knights didn't need help with the castle path. With the help of Mind Blast and Cone of Cold, they were very effective, especially when they shattered the undead we froze. Helping the militia by the chantry was much harder. After a few tries, the best strategy I found was to use Earthquake and Grease to slow approaching enemies so the militia could use their bows. They were far more effective with bows, and the longer we could keep the undead off of them, the better things went. Once the undead inevitably made it into melee range, we'd use Cone of Cold and Flame Blast if we could do so without hitting too many of the militia. Mind Blast was extremely useful because it doesn't stun allies. We also tried using frost weapons. Not that frost damage would be all that useful against undead, but I wanted to see if it worked on non-party allies. It did nothing, so I assume similar spells like flaming or force weapons wouldn't work either. Sadly, none of the militia survived even during our best attempt where we managed to keep the first couple waves off them. Even if we had more mana, Grease and Earthquake have long cooldowns, so we couldn't keep them up constantly. It's a shame we couldn't tell the militia to fall back to the path leading up to the knights, because then the undead would have been funneled into approaching from one direction instead of three, and we might have been able to keep them under control while the militia turned them into pincushions. As it was, we had to fall back to the knights, take out the undead that followed us, then lure the next wave to the knights until the game said we were done.
Here's what I propose. I go in with Isolde, and you enter the castle using the secret passage. My signet ring unlocks the door. Perhaps I will distract whatever evil is inside and increase your chances of getting in unnoticed. What do you say? I wish I knew. I don't know any more about this evil force than Isolde seems to. Sir Perth and his men can watch for danger at the castle entrance. If you can open the gates from within, they can move in and help you. I don't think there's anyone else who can help you. If you choose not to go, then it's up to me to do what I can. Here is my signet ring. It will open the lock on the door in the mill. Whatever you do, Eamon is the priority here. If you have to, just get him out of there. Isolde, me, and anyone else, we are expendable.
Despite the obvious danger Tegan is walking into, we can leave with no consequences, but we need all the XP we can get, so we may as well clear out the castle. The undead are surprisingly easy to deal with as long as we lure them back to us, ideally through a doorway, so we can catch them all with Cone of Cold and Flame Blast. The only tricky fight before the courtyard is against 3 lesser shades and 1 greater shade, which took several tries to beat without using too many potions. We ended up freezing them and using Stone Fist on the lesser shades to shatter them. Shattering is a one-shot, but most enemies with yellow names and all enemies with boss health bars are immune, so we mostly use it to get rid of minions. In the courtyard, we faced a Revenant. The first time we fought it, we let Sir Perth and his knights in to help us, but we reloaded and handled the battle ourselves because I wasn't sure if we got XP when the knights took it out. Likewise, we left Sir Perth outside while we took on Tegan and his mind-controlled soldiers in the audience room. I don't know how Tegan managed to survive what we did to him, but I'm not complaining. As I said earlier, there's no time limit for getting help for Connor. Despite Tegan's implication that the risk only grows the longer we're away, we can do literally every other available quest and everything will be fine. On that note, we need more golden XP before we visit the Circle Tower, so we head to the Frostback Mountains to enter Orzammar after completing some side quests we picked up in Redcliffe. One of which involved being chased around a rock by a giant bear for 15 minutes. Seriously, this was the only way we could avoid getting mauled. We're confronted by one of Loghain's toadies at Orzammar's gates. We could intimidate him, but he's an annoying snot, we need XP, and the guard certainly isn't interested in protecting him, so we fight instead. The toughest part was dealing with the mage with a ton of healing abilities. Sadly, Mana Cleanse is bugged and restores the enemy's mana instead of reducing it, so it doesn't help. We only took it because it's a prerequisite for Mana Clash. Mana Drain was helpful, especially in combination with the Vulnerability Hex, which doubles the effectiveness of both mana and life drain. It took a few tries to get an attempt where we took out the mage before the other two broke free of our crowd control, but once we managed that, we were able to lead the other two in circles and freeze them with Cone of Cold until the fight was over. Now that we're in Orzammar, it's time for side quests. I won't be going into detail for the sake of time, but they help flesh out Dwarven society. I think the dwarves are one of the most nuanced groups in the Dragon Age series. Their society is deeply flawed and mired in tradition, but I can't help but admire them for surviving what is essentially an endless blight. When the Darkspawn aren't invading the surface, they're fighting the dwarves. I love the way Orzammar looks too. It's what I think of when I think of dwarves. I also find the Dalish interesting and would love to see a game set in the Dales before the Chantry steamrolled them, but they have fewer interactions, so there isn't as much opportunity to learn about them outside the Codex. I'm also pretty sure they got retconned from children with magic are in short supply and swapped between Dalish clans so everyone has a keeper, to they throw their mageborn to the wolves if they have a first and second already, to remove the reasonable solution of maybe train your mages and let them be a normal part of society, and most of them won't resort to blood magic from later games. Anyway, now that I've kicked the hornet's nest, let's get to the reason we're here. We need the dwarves' aid against the Blight, but their king recently passed away and the assembly is deadlocked between two candidates, Balin and Harrowmont. Dwarven Noble is my favorite origin, so I know Balin is power hungry, and several other things I won't say for the sake of YouTube. Use your imagination. However, in my opinion, he's also better for Orzammar. He lessens the rigidity of the caste system, strengthens the dwarves' connections with the surface, and generally works to ensure they'll survive even if it means they have to change. Harrowmont, despite being a more honorable person, leads the dwarves further into stagnation. And now that I've kicked that hornet's nest, there's a pragmatic reason for siding with Balin as well. Participating in the provings for Balin is optional, so if we do his tasks and enter the provings for him, we get more XP than we would if we helped Harrowmont. Speaking of the provings, they're now open to us. Before we do the regular matches, we try the off-the-books ones. These are all supposed to be team battles, so we're facing 4 enemies. Almost all of them are lieutenant rank, meaning they're immune to shattering. They're also tougher and shake off crowd control effects faster than standard enemies. The first match is doable if we focus on the Blood Mage. Apparently the Provings Armsman was very serious about these matches having no rules. It takes many tries, largely because the 3 dwarven fighters have 10% spell resistance from being dwarves, on top of whatever they get from their rank and the difficulty. The second match was a nightmare. The champion buffed his allies, and the Dust Town Thug could stun us from long range with Scattershot. Not all talents are auto hits, but according to the wiki, Scattershot is, so more missile deflection and defense wouldn't help. Once he stunned us, his allies pummeled us and kept us stunned or knocked down with talents like Pommel Strike, so the Dust Town Thug could end the fight whenever he had his crossbow out. We had to keep him locked down with crowd control, or get in his face so he'd switch to his melee weapons. He wouldn't stay in melee, but it'd prevent him from using Scattershot for a bit. After many tries, we tried on normal. Unlike dropping the difficulty from Nightmare to Hard, which felt like night and day, the difference between Hard and Normal was subtle. We did a bit more damage and our spells were resisted slightly less often. Remember, they're lieutenant-ranked dwarves, so they have spell resistance regardless. What I noticed most was that our crowd control lasted longer, at least when it worked, and our healing was slightly stronger. That's it. Don't get me wrong, it helped, but it did not make the fight easy and it took several more tries to win. I considered loading back, keeping the difficulty on hard, and ignoring these matches for now, but if we're struggling with this, what hope do we have against the Archdemon? I think we could have won that match on hard with enough patience, and the third match as well. Their Dusttown Thug presented all the same problems as the last one, but their Arcane Warrior wasn't a healer and didn't have crowd control spells, so we could ignore him until we removed his allies. That said, it took us a long time to whittle him down because of his crazy spell resistance. We had to hit him with our basic attacks when he stopped to recast his buffs. It was the first fight where I was really glad we grabbed the heal spell so we could heal ourselves without relying on life drain, which the Arcane Warrior almost always resisted. So if I think we could have eventually beaten the second and third matches on hard, what about the fourth match? Yeah, no, it probably would have required us to wait until we had Mana Clash to deal with their Elven healer. On top of that, they also had a Dusttown Thug and a champion, so it was the worst parts of the last 3 matches combined. We beat them on normal, but it took so many tries. We targeted the healer and all our single target spells were initially aimed at her, but we had to keep her and the Dusttown Thug controlled with Cone of Cold, Mind Blast, Grease, anything we had. And ideally disable the melee attackers too, because if they closed in, they could use Pommel Strike. We didn't have enough crowd control to keep them locked down without Grease and Earthquake luck, and those spells made them scatter, which made it difficult to hit them with Cone of Cold. We could lead the melee fighters around, but the healer and Dusttown Thug were harder to herd. We could try to chase them or push them with Stone Fist, but if they ran in completely different directions, it was often the end of the attempt. The first time we took out the healer and Dusttown Thug, we finished the melee fighters with no issues, but I lost count of the number of attempts it took to get that far. The normal provings were easy with the exception of the last match against Piaten, which was the only one that was supposed to be a team match. It was a bit dicey while Piaten had his friends, but after they were down, we led him in circles until we had enough mana to freeze him with Cone of Cold, and followed up with Drain Life, Flame Blast, or basic attacks. He almost took us out near the end when he resisted Cone of Cold and took the opportunity to use Shield Assault, which did a ton of damage and stunned us, but we managed to chug a potion before the stun kicked in and just survived it. We dedicated our victory to Balin. There's a support point system that affects a few things like what reward we get at the end, but we aren't too worried about it. Now that we're done faffing around, let's do what Vartag asked us to do for Balin. The initial quests require talking to the Dwarven Deshirs and winning their support. However, the leader of House Dace is on an expedition in the Deep Roads, a network of tunnels that once connected the Dwarven cities but is now lost to Darkspawn, and we need to fetch him so we can change his house's vote. I expected the enemies in the tunnels to be difficult to deal with, but we tore through most of them in 1 or 2 attempts. There were some emissaries, Darkspawn mages, but none of them were above normal rank, so as long as we led them and their allies around a corner and caught them with Cone of Cold, we were fine. We were ambushed by Deep Stalkers a couple times, but Mind Blast bought us time to move away and get them to form an orderly Cone of Cold queue. The Harrowmont fanatics in the streets of Orzammar weren't bad either. In fact, we wandered around to make sure we got them all. The fights against the Carta, however, were tricky. The one we had to beat to get the token to enter their base ambushed us in a tiny house, and even with Mind Blast, we took a few hits before the battle properly started. If too many resisted the Mind Blast, we wouldn't make it to the corner we needed to wedge ourselves into before casting Cone of Cold and Flame Blast on the lot of them. But we didn't need perfect luck, so it only took a few tries. Once we were in the hideout, we hit level 12 and got Mana Clash and rank 4 Coercion, the two things we needed before visiting the Circle Tower or the Brazilian Forest. I intended to finish off the Carta and then leave Orzammar, but we were injured when we looted some costume rings. They're quest related and we were supposed to read a codex entry to learn which one we needed, but I'd been up all night so I was on autopilot and just grabbed everything. We don't have a party to save us, so we either win battles with no injuries or we game over, so we haven't kept injury kits. We had to go back to camp to heal the injuries, and since we had to leave, I figured we might as well head to the Circle Tower. Now that we have Mana Clash, it should be easy, and hopefully we'll find gear there. We're using the same gear we had in the Kokari Wilds, with the sole exception of the key to the city ring we found in Orzammar. We're very overdue for a new staff and robe. When we arrive at the circle, we visit the quartermaster near the entrance and purchase the last tome of Arcane Technique. We use it to take the Affliction Hex spell, which lowers the damage resistances of the target and nearby enemies. It stacks with the Hex of Vulnerability if we want a ton of damage on one target. Once we enter the tower, we're stuck until we save Irving, but the first few encounters are promising. I assumed Mana Clash was a single target spell. It isn't. It hits a huge area and can one-shot groups of abominations and demons. Not far in, we find a group of mages that have put up a barrier blocking off the rest of the tower. They're led by Wynn, a senior enchanter we met at Ostagar. Wynn and I don't always get along, but she tries to help people and I respect her enough to compromise. Sadly, that doesn't matter. We must avoid having companions in our party when possible, and she refuses to stay put until we save Irving. She's maintaining the barrier, so we either have to bring her along, which would only be allowed if there were no alternatives, or we have to say we intend to cleanse the entire circle, including her and the mages with her. As much as I hate that, I can't see a way around it. I tried going around her to see if we could interact with the barrier, but Wynn interrupted us whenever we got near it. We tried forcing her out of the party and told her to stay put to no avail. If anyone knows a way to keep Wynn alive without her joining the party here, let me know in the comments, because as it stands, this seems to be the only way to resolve the situation for solo runs. Further up the tower, we run into undead, shades, and abominations. The undead are as easy to deal with as the ones in Redcliffe were, and the shades, abominations, and lesser demons are one-shots with Mana Clash. A couple of the tougher demons, like the optional boss Rage demon in the basement, were tough enough to survive Mana Clash and took a couple tries to beat, but the enemies that did our heads in were the possessed Templars. Their Holy Smite can hit from long range through walls and does a decent chunk of damage. More importantly, Holy Smite stuns us for a long while, giving the Templars plenty of time to hack us to pieces. The only way around this that I found was to start the fight through a wall using Earthquake, so we could lure them out and freeze them with Cone of Cold. Sometimes that didn't work, depending on when and if they decided to use Holy Smite. A few floors up, we come across a powerful sloth demon who puts us to sleep. There's no way to avoid this. We could have all the willpower and spell resistance in the world, and it would still happen. We can use these glowing objects to permanently increase an attribute. We don't get to assign the points, each object increases a certain one. We're especially interested in magic, willpower, and constitution. If I had routed this better, we would have gotten Mana Clash and come here earlier so we could use these objects to get cunning for coercion and invested our level up points elsewhere. Most fights here assume we don't have our party because we'd have been split up into different nightmares, so they're easy. But there's tons of backtracking while we get the Fade shape-shifting forms to access certain paths. The only battle of note is the one against the Sloth Demon that trapped us here, and only his first form, the Ogre, gave us trouble. If he spammed massive attacks and ram, he could keep us knocked down, and he nearly managed to take us out a couple times that way. But once we got him out of that form, we took him out in relative safety. The 2 lyrium veins kept our mana and health topped up, so we didn't have to use too many potions. It's a good thing too, because we needed every lyrium potion we had when we faced Uldred, the blood mage who got possessed by a pride demon and caused this whole mess. He wouldn't have been too bad except he had the telekinetic cage spell, which did decent damage and locked us in place for a long while. He cast it 3 times during the winning attempt. We resisted it once, but the other 2 times we barely survived on a sliver of health, despite having full health when he caught us in the cage. You'd think, with him being a demon that's throwing spells around, he'd be vulnerable to mana drain and mana clash, right? Wrong! For some reason I can't fathom, other than that BioWare didn't want their big bad to lose 1/3 of his health to 1 spell, Uldred isn't considered to be a valid target for those. I call bull. Give him high spirit resistance so he doesn't take a ton of damage from Mana Clash if you want BioWare, but don't lie to my face and say he doesn't have mana. We saved Irving with the Litany of Adralla despite Uldred's repeated possession attempts, so we were able to gain the Circle's support despite what we did to win. I guess everyone assumed the demons and abominations got her, and we certainly aren't going to correct them. We tell Irving about Connor, and Irving agrees to help. We'll meet him in Redcliffe Castle shortly. Now that we've completed a main quest, Loghain is informed of our existence. He sends an Antivan crow, Zevran, after us, so we'll have to deal with him soon. We stop by Honleith before we head to Redcliffe. It's the DLC village where we're supposed to recruit Shale, but it's easy to avoid recruiting her, so I figured clearing out the Darkspawn for XP and gold would be fine. Afterwards, we return to Redcliffe Castle and talk to Irving, and I'd like input from all of you. I may attempt rogue and warrior solo runs, but only a mage can enter the Fade to save Connor. We're fine for this run, but as a warrior or rogue, our options would be limited. 1. We send a mage companion into the Fade, which would be against the rules. 2. We send Jowen or Irving into the Fade. They aren't permanent companions, but it may still be against the spirit of a solo run. 3. We kill Connor, which is the only resolution a non-mage can do themselves. In short, I want to know if saving Connor with Irving or Jowen is allowed in rogue and warrior solo runs. So put that in the comments and I'll go with whichever one has the most support when I start the next solo run. For this run, we simply enter the Fade ourselves, and with our rank 4 coercion, we can get a reward from the demon and drive it away without a fight. We can have the demon teach us blood magic, do 2 pointless things, or give us a tome that grants a spell point. For anyone wondering, allowing a rogue or warrior to send Jowen or Irving would not let them make these deals, so they shouldn't be a factor in your decision. I considered unlocking blood magic, but we don't need or want to use health instead of mana to cast spells. Unlike most mages, we get hit a lot, and the only useful spell is Blood Wound. Don't get me wrong, it's great for debilitating targets that have blood and it ignores spell resistance, but it also takes 3 spell points to get to it, and I'd rather have another spell point, so we take the tome. Out on the road, we run into Zevran, the Antivan crow Loghain hired. To his credit, his crew did manage to take us out a couple times thanks to their mage with a paralysis spell. But once we got an attempt where we froze her with Cone of Cold before she paralyzed us, it was easy to shatter her and deal with the rest of them. Thanks to our glorious hat that's giving me Terrahail vibes, a sustained spell we recently acquired, Arcane Shroud, and the dexterity from the Fade, our defense is significantly better. It's enough to dodge most incoming hits, in fact. We didn't bother talking to Zevran. We can't recruit him, so what would be the point? The Dalish in the Brazilian forest are less suspicious of us since we're an elf, but we aren't a Dalish elf, so they're still standoffish. Given what they've been through, I'd say it's warranted. Their craftsman, Varathorn, is the only trader with a limitless supply of elf fruit, the main component of health potions. He'll also have a skill point tome and a manual that unlocks the shapeshifting specialization after we complete 3 main quests. Completing Nature of the Beast, the quest for the Dalish, will count as one of those 3 quests, but we have to complete it in a way that keeps the Dalish alive and friendly to us. Keep that in mind going forward. Most of the battles in the forest aren't worth talking about, but once we're in the ruin the werewolves are holed up in, things get nasty. First, we have to fight a boss-rank arcane horror with Winter's Grasp and Paralysis, which can easily disable us while it takes us out. It also has very high spell resistance. The only way we managed to close in to use spells like Cone of Cold was by hitting the arcane horror with Stone Fist to knock it down while he ran in, and then we had to hope Cone of Cold wasn't resisted so we'd have time to cast our hexes and Mana Clash. We never got Mana Clash through, at least not while the arcane horror had enough mana left for it to do anything. Instead, we ended up rolling enough lucky paralysis resistances to run down the arcane horror's mana and eventually got enough flame blasts through to take it out. After that, we ran into a large pack of werewolves. Up until this point, we hadn't had much trouble with werewolves, but this area had a bunch of shadow werewolves that could stealth and had the Overwhelm ability. Overwhelm locks down and mauls a humanoid target, and for us it's a death sentence unless we're at full health. Getting past this took several tries, and we had to resort to casting Earthquake through the door before we opened it to reveal the shadow werewolves. Even then, victory was far from certain. We had to keep the shadow werewolves under perfect control. If they closed in for even a moment, they would likely use Overwhelm and it would all be over. During the successful attempt, one of them did use Overwhelm, but it was right as we cast Cone of Cold, so we froze it and interrupted the Overwhelm, which really confused the game for a moment. While we were exploring the ruins, we found a life gem with the spirit of an ancient arcane warrior inside it. It teaches us the arcane warrior specialization in exchange for granting it oblivion. For some reason, the shapeshifter specialization was also unlocked while we were wandering around the forest, even though we haven't spoken to Morrigan since we left Lothering, and we haven't read the manual. I'm at a loss, guys. If I blundered into a glitch, I swear it was by sheer dumb luck. We just hit level 14, so we have both our specialization points available, and we're going to unlock Shapeshifter and Arcane Warrior. I'm hoping Arcane Warrior will allow us to use a wider variety of armor, maybe even a shield, and shapeshifting might be useful. If nothing else, it gives us constitution and armor just for taking the shapeshifter specialization.
It was Zathrian who created the curse that these creatures suffer. The same curse that Zathrian's own people now suffer. Zathrian was a young man then. He had a son and daughter he loved greatly. And while out hunting, the human tribe captured them both.
Zathrian came to this ruin and summoned a terrible spirit, binding it to the body of a great wolf. So Witherfang came to be. Witherfang hunted the humans of the tribe. Many were killed, but others were cursed by his blood, becoming twisted and savage creatures.
Sounds like the Dalish Keeper owes us an explanation, and conveniently, he's alone at the entrance to the ruin. I thought we'd need coercion to convince him to come with us, but no, we just had to hit the right dialogue options. Sadly, negotiations broke down, and Zathrian said some variant of "my thirst for revenge will never be quenched" about 5 times. The key is that we didn't encourage the lady to attack. If we had, we'd have sided with the werewolves in a way that wouldn't end the curse and would make the Dalish hostile. Instead, we told Zathrian we'd make him end the curse if we had to, which I guess encourages the lady to show mercy after we pummel Zathrian into a more reasonable state. Speaking of, that took a couple tries because the two Sylvans with Zathrian could take us out if they used their roots, which damages us and locks us down. A running theme of this run is that enemies with lockdown abilities are terrifying. However, on the third attempt, we closed in and froze Zathrian and one of the Sylvans with Cone of Cold. We could have survived the other Sylvan using roots while they were frozen, but it didn't, and that gave us plenty of time to put hexes on Zathrian and cast Mana Clash. Look at that damage. Look at it! It nearly one-shot Zathrian, and we followed up with a Flame Blast before they thawed out, and one of the Sylvans used roots. The fire damage finished off Zathrian. We probably lost XP because we didn't take out the Sylvans first, but it was worth it. It also meant Zathrian got to have his change of heart and break the curse while on fire. Zathrian and the lady pass on, and the people infected with lycanthropy are cured. Linnea, the new keeper, doesn't blame us for Zathrian's death, so the Dalish pledge their aid for the final battle. We finish up some side quests, including the Unintended Consequences Chanter's Board one that gives us the Magus War Boots. We lose the magic from the Fade Striders we found during our origin, but we gain some armor and 12 defense. We also go shopping before we head back to Orzammar. The Reaper's vestments would give us constitution, spell resistance, and armor, but the robe of the first enchanter sold by Caesar and Antivan merchant in Denerim, after we bring the crows tragic news, is a lot cheaper and gives us willpower, magic, and defense. We may buy the Reaper's vestments if we have enough gold after we buy the other gear we want. For staves, I was torn between Winter's Breath and the Staff of the Magister Lord. Winter's Breath is cheaper and gives us bonus cold damage, but the Staff of the Magister Lord gives us willpower, spell power, mana regeneration, and bonus spirit and fire damage. That purchase wiped out our coin purse, so upgrading our rings and belt will have to wait. We already have a good amulet and helm, the Magister's shield, and the Libertarian's cowl, so we're good there. With our new equipment and our arcane shield, we have over 100 defense. This allows us to dodge most attacks, although tougher enemies with higher attack can still hit us, and some talents and most spells always hit, so we aren't invulnerable. It served us well against the remaining Carta members in Orzammar. We even tore through Jarvia on our first try with only one close call where she managed to hit us a couple times in a row. On our way into the deep roads, we're stopped by Oghren, who insisted on coming along to find Branka. As far as I know, there's no way to avoid recruiting Oghren here. We led the conversation through every meandering tangent, but he still joined in the end. However, unlike Wynn, we don't have to add him to our party, so he'll hang out with Alistair and Morrigan. Most of the fights in the deep roads go as well as the last few fights against the Carta. Our high defense really helps against enemies without spells or auto-hit talents, which for the moment is most of them, and Mana Clash takes care of the few emissaries we run into. However, things get more difficult once we make it to the Ortan Taig. The spirits and stone golems are easy to deal with, but the giant spiders are not. They have poison spit, and we're slightly vulnerable to nature poison damage because our Magister's Shield amulet gives us a 10% weakness to nature damage. They can also stun us with webs, and if they stagger their webs, they can keep us disabled for a long while if we're facing a group of spiders. Some of them have Overwhelm. Remember the talent the Shadow Werewolves tore us a new one with? As far as I can tell, their webs, poison spit, and overwhelm are auto-hit abilities, so our defense only helps against their basic attacks. Don't get me wrong, that's still useful and keeps them from ripping us apart while we're webbed up, but their poison can spell our doom if we aren't careful. We do have nature salves, including a greater one we picked up somewhere. I'll be honest, we have it by sheer luck. I haven't been paying attention to salves other than hoarding whatever we happen to find to appease my just-in-case mind goblin. However, I want to save that for the fight against the corrupted Spider Queen. It's one of the few boss fights I have clear memories of, and I remember it being very difficult even with a full party, so I suspect we may need it then. Before we get to the corrupted Spider Queen, we have to take down the Fade Beast summoned at the end of the Asunder side quest. After we gather the demon's body parts, we take them to an altar in the Orton Tig and reassemble them, because apparently that seemed like a good idea. Surprise, surprise, it wasn't a good idea and summons a pride demon similar to Uldred. It offers us 25 gold pieces if we let it go, which is tempting and doesn't affect the game negatively. Although the quest log implies the demon causes a lot of destruction, there aren't any actual consequences. But fighting it would grant us over 100 XP, so we're gonna fight it. Like Uldred, it isn't vulnerable to mana drain or mana clash, despite being a creature from the Fade who uses spells. Seriously, this feels like a bug. It also has a Frost Burst similar to Winter's Grasp, a Firebolt that's like a single target Flame Blast, and the Telekinetic Cage spell that Uldred had. It can also dispel our Arcane Shield and Spell Wisp with Mana Wave. Note the word mana, although we can interrupt it with Cone of Cold. The other spells are too fast to stop in most cases. We can survive the Telekinetic Cage as long as we're close to full health and the Fade Beast doesn't use Firebolt or land a basic attack before it wears off. We do our best to keep it locked down with Cone of Cold and Winter's Grasp. Stone Fist, Grease, Earthquake, and Mind Blast don't affect it, so freezing is the only form of crowd control we have that works. I wish we'd invested in Paralysis or Petrify instead of the Spider form, so we had more crowd control spells, because shape-shifting has several downsides. We can't use our spells, only the creature's abilities while shape-shifted. We can work with that, especially if we shapeshift while we're waiting for cooldowns. However, shapeshifting also turns off all other sustained spells, such as Arcane Shield. This means we have less defense while shapeshifted despite our spider form having high dexterity, and it makes the whole process kind of annoying because we have to set up our sustained spells again when we change back. Other than Cone of Cold, we use our Hexes and Flame Blasts, along with Drain Life and more potions than I'd care to admit to take out the Fade Beast. Eventually. It took a few attempts. Now for the corrupted Spider Queen. Not gonna lie, this fight ticked me off. First, we had to clear out the Genlock emissaries and corrupted spiders lurking nearby. We did not want to deal with them and the Queen at the same time. That was easy enough, but once we engaged the Queen, things went to hell in a handbasket. At the start of the battle, she webs us, disappears, and summons 2 corrupted spiders. Remember, corrupted spiders have web, poison spit, and overwhelm, so they're dangerous. The Queen doesn't stay gone long, and she spams stacking poison spit. If she hits us more than a couple times with it, we're toast. It melts our health. Using a Greater Nature Salve does help, but it doesn't stop the Queen and the corrupted spiders from webbing us and spamming more poison spit, or worse, catching us with overwhelm. After a few tries, we resorted to starting with Earthquake so we could slow the corrupted spiders down and run away despite the Queen's initial web. Once we finished off those first 2 spiders, we returned to the Queen and led her around a pillar behind her nest so any new corrupted spiders wouldn't join the fight. From there, we did our best to keep her frozen, hexed, and on fire, and thanks to the Greater Nature Salve, Drain Life, and health potions, we were able to survive the Queen's never-ending poison spit barrage long enough to put her down. However, this wasn't the end of the fight. We were able to save so we didn't have to fight the Queen again, but several waves of corrupted spiders spawned in the nest while we were fighting the Queen, and we had to deal with them. This took a few tries. Again, corrupted spiders are dangerous, and we're fighting a ton of them at once. They can easily keep us webbed forever, and they're spread out around the nest so we can't catch them in a Cone of Cold. We slowed them down with earthquakes so we could lead them across a bridge and into a tunnel, or we could hit them with a cone of cold and a flame blast before we got webbed. There weren't enough survivors to keep us webbed up after that. Or more accurately, they weren't smart enough to coordinate their webs to that degree, and once we got another chance to use Mind Blast and Cone of Cold, it was over. The journal near the corrupted Spider Queen's nest points even further into the deep roads, past a Broodmother. I'm not going to linger on this fight because 1, I find the Broodmothers to be needlessly edgy, and 2, YouTube would pitch a fit if I let you take a good look at it. Thanks to our high defense, the tentacles and darkspawn minions rarely hit us. Even the Broodmother herself can't do much. It just takes a while to take everything out. Past the Broodmother, we find Bronca at the entrance to a gauntlet of traps protecting the Anvil of the Void. We're locked in until we find the Anvil, and Oghren appears from thin air to force his way into the party. Unlike Wynn, we don't have the option of attacking him, so we have no choice but to remove his gear and set his tactics to wait. Thankfully, there are very few conversations as we make our way through the gauntlet, so he mostly holds position near the entrance and stays out of combat. He does get moved up to join us in front of this thing with 4 stone faces that summon spirits. Each face summons a spirit, and banishing the spirit allows us to fire a bolt that damages one of the faces. Each face must be hit twice to take it out. Thankfully, the spirits only attack us if we attack them, so we can fight them one at a time until we destroy all the faces. Despite siding with Caridin against Bronca, Oghren stands with us. By which I mean he stands there until golems pummel him into submission. Once again, we were fine for most of the fight thanks to our defense. Getting the new equipment and Arcane Shroud was a major turning point for the run, because so few enemies can consistently hit us. Now that we have the allegiance of the dwarves and Oghren has returned to camp, it's time to follow up on the lead we found on the Urn of Sacred Ashes while we were side questing around Dinnerum. It doesn't take long for the creepy village of Haven to reveal that it's a cult and attack us. The cultist Reavers and Archers struggle to hit us, although the Reavers hit hard if they land a blow. The Mages can be dangerous as most of them have crowd control spells, but we have Mana Clash, so they rarely have an opportunity to cause trouble. Also, may I take a moment to say how disappointed I was when I found this dragon egg on my first playthrough, and it turned out to be nothing but a container? I wanted a dragonling. We could corrupt the urn with dragon's blood, but that would unlock a warrior specialization, and I'm trying to avoid unlocking other classes' specializations before their solo runs, so we're going to fight Colgrim instead. We're also going to slay the high dragon they were worshipping, for funsies. Would you believe we first tried it? Because we did. To be clear, it took some potions to accomplish that because the dragon's fire breath hurt, but we froze it with Cone of Cold when it tried to buffet us with its wings to pull us into melee, and then got it in a loop where it kept flying back and forth instead of attacking. The fight still took a while because it had a lot of health and was, unsurprisingly, immune to fire, but it also took decent damage from our frost spells. I'm suddenly feeling a lot better about our odds against the Archdemon, although it's a fair bit tougher. The trials leading up to the urn are mostly riddles. I wasn't sure if the bridge puzzle would work without companions, but the game gives us ash wraiths to put on the switches, so it was fine. We had to fight a duplicate of ourselves that didn't have the right spells. For some reason, she had Dispel even though we don't, so I'm not sure what was up with that. We took a pinch of the ashes to heal Arl Eamon, but before we head to Redcliffe, we have a couple errands. First, we purchased the Andruil's Blessing Belt from the Quartermaster in the Circle Tower. It'll counteract the nature weakness on our amulet, fortify our lackluster physical resistance, and boost our attributes and mana regeneration. We also bought the Life Giver ring from Garen in Orzammar. I was torn between it and the Ring of Ages, but decided the armor, constitution, and health regen would be better than 20% to non-physical resistances. I regret taking the Arcane Warrior specialization because none of our gear needs strength. I tried using Spellweaver with a shield, but it wasn't worth giving up the better mana and spell power bonuses from our Staff of the Magister Lord, not to mention its ranged attack. Maybe if we had a better shield, the sword and board combo would be more enticing, but the best shields either have to be stolen, require a different origin, require DLC I don't have, or can't be obtained until near the end. Shapeshifter at least gave us constitution and armor, but other than letting us use strength gear with magic, Arcane Warrior only gave us dexterity and attack. I'd rather have constitution and spell power from Blood Mage, or health regen and magic from Spirit Healer. To be clear, I've never played an Arcane Warrior before, so it's entirely possible I'm missing something, but there doesn't seem to be enough supporting gear. In fact, Spellweaver is the only thing I found. Heavy armors have bonuses that benefit warriors, strength and stamina bonuses, for example. And equipment with bonuses for magic or defense is either made for mages to begin with and doesn't require strength, or is meant for rogues and either outright class restricted or requires dexterity. An Arcane Warrior doesn't let us replace dexterity with magic. Another thing to consider is that heavy armors cause fatigue, which makes our spells cost more mana. There's one more thing we're going to do before we meet up with Arl Eamon and commence the final parts of the main quest, Morrigan's Companion Quest. I fully understand if you consider this to be against the rules, but hear me out. Morrigan's quest doesn't require us to bring her along. In fact, it requires us to leave her behind. All we have to do is give her the black grimoire we found in the Circle Tower and agree to confront Flemeth without her. In my mind, this makes Morrigan no different than a non-companion quest giver. She asks us to complete a task, we complete it, and we report back. And I really wanted to see if Flemeth would put up more of a fight than the High Dragon we faced near Haven. Spoiler alert, she only put up a slightly better fight because we couldn't get her stuck in a flight loop, and she used her fire attacks more often. Otherwise, it went the same way. I anticipate these fights being harder as a non-mage. Large dragons have a grab attack that would probably spell our doom if we were in melee range for long, so we'd have to lean on archery. Let me know if you want me to attempt Morrigan's quest in future solo runs, or if you think it's against the rules since it is technically a companion quest. I guess if it's against the rules then this run is a failure, but other than some XP, it doesn't give us anything of note, so it doesn't affect the run all that much. We finally return to Redcliffe to heal Arl Eamon with the ashes, and we set out for Dinnerum to attend the Lands Meet. Most of the tasks here involve a lot of speech checks, and those aren't any different in this run than they'd be normally. However, we do have to save Queen Honora from Arlhouse Estate and fight some Tevinter slavers in the Elven alienage. First, rescuing Honora. We get inside by passing ourselves as a guard. They somehow don't notice our arcane shroud. We don't actually equip guard armor, it's just cosmetic, so we didn't need to be an arcane warrior to do this. We get to Honora without incident, but I guess the devs decided that would be too boring because Arl Howe apparently has mages in his employ and has had them put a barrier over the door to Honora's room. Despite being a mage, we cannot interact with this barrier in any way. Maybe if we knew Dispel? Regardless, we have to find the mage with Howe and take them out. And once we enter the dungeon, we're found out, so we start flambeing every guard in our way. None of the fights in the dungeon are difficult thanks to our high defense and mana clash. Even Howe struggles to do anything to us. The battle against Sir Cawthron was a bit more eventful because she hits like a truck. I wasn't surprised because we're supposed to surrender, but to hiffle with that. We ran back into the hall when the fight started and most of her henchmen stayed behind, so we were able to focus on Cawthron and a few that followed her. Is it Cawthron or Catherine? Okay, moving on. We kept them locked down by freezing them, stunning them, and sometimes knocking them down with Stone Fist. We also recently gained the paralysis spell, giving us another single target crowd control option. Once Catherine was down, defeating the remaining guards was simple. As for the Teventers preying on the alienage, the few who aren't bog standard henchmen are mages. We have Mana Clash, need I say more. It even one-shots their leader, although he got a sliver of health from the cutscene where he bargained with us, futilely. Arranging a marriage between Alistair and Honora took longer, and that isn't saying much. Despite the Landsmeet voting overwhelmingly in our favor, Loghain still wishes to duel us, and as far as I know, we can't laugh in his face and tell him to take his lumps. To be honest, that would have been more dignified than the thrashing we gave him. For what it's worth, I do think Arl Eamon is attempting to set up Alistair as a puppet, as an unhardened Alistair does not acclimate well to being king and largely leaves the running of the kingdom to others. Unless the Warden becomes Chancellor or Alistair marries Honora, I assume that means Arl Eamon is in charge. With the Civil War finally settled, we can turn our attention to the blight that's been ravaging the countryside. We meet the forces gathering in Redcliffe only to find the castle under attack by Darkspawn. Apparently no one could be bothered to lower the gate, but that's fine, we'll just... Oh my. That's a big ogre. This is fine. This is completely 100% fine. We get past the attack on our second attempt by employing the big brain strategy of not letting the ogre ram us into a corner and meet up with Arl Eamon, only to find out the bulk of the horde, including the archdemon, are about to arrive in Denerim. We just came from there. We turned down Morrigan's ritual because to me, accepting her offer would mean that she helped us survive the final battle. In fact, since we aren't playing a male warden, it would mean we had help from her and Alistair. When we arrive in Denerim, we have to split the party. We aren't allowed to leave everyone at camp this time. I forgot that the party members left behind have to handle a fight, so I guess this will have to be an exception during solo runs. I'd rather have them handle this fight by themselves than bring them into the final battle. But since Morrigan left and we haven't picked up any optional party members, I think this is the lowest number of companions we can have for their fight. Before we get to their fight, we have to get to the fortress where Riordan hopes to lure the archdemon. We make our way through the market, which has so many ogres. None of them are ogre alphas, thankfully, but we have to be very careful to avoid being grabbed. We take out one of the Darkspawn generals in the market, and then fight through the alienage to take out the second one because I'd rather not face the generals and the archdemon at the same time. Thankfully, the alienage has far fewer ogres, and the second general is a mage, so Mana Clash takes him down easily, but there are so many Darkspawn that it takes a while to chew through them. I wish we'd picked up Blizzard so we could put one down where the Darkspawn grunts were coming in and forget about them, but we ran out of spell points. We spent our last ones on Petrify and Paralyze. If you decide to do this challenge, I'd recommend taking Blizzard or maybe Fireball instead of the Shape-Shifting or Arcane Warrior spells, but we did well enough with what we had. Once we arrive at the fortress, we shift over to Alistair and Oghren at the gates. BioWare likely expected us to be using the B team and possibly not have a full party. Remember, we'd normally have taken 3 companions with us into Denerim, so the enemies aren't that tough. We could let the soldiers handle it, but where's the fun in that? Alistair and Oghren won't be able to rejoin us, so we may as well let them use their level ups and whatever gear we happen to have. We put their tactics on whatever preset looked half decent and let them run around hitting Darkspawn for a bit. The soldiers still handled most of it, but they got to participate. With that done, we switch back to the Warden and fight our way to the top of the fortress where Riordan crashed the Archdemon. I was pretty sleep deprived by this point, and I'd been playing for over 10 hours, but I really wanted to finish the run, so if it looks like I was falling asleep at the controls, that's because I was. I don't remember the fights in the fortress, but I remember the Archdemon. As long as we didn't get too close, the archdemon simply couldn't do much to us, especially if we used our heroic defense spell to raise our damage resistances. However, it summoned tons of darkspawn, and if enough of them surrounded us and knocked us down or stunned us, things could go very bad very fast. We could summon allies of our own, but it was best to just stay out of the middle of the rooftop. The other parts of the roof were far enough away from the spawn points that the darkspawn minions wouldn't get involved. The fight wasn't hard once we figured out how to avoid being swarmed by the horde, but it took ages. Despite beating the Archdemon on our second attempt, I have an hour of footage fighting it, and I am struggling to come up with things to say about the battle. We had tons of flasks and elf roots, and thanks to our high magic, which boosts the effectiveness of potions, a lesser health poultice heals about 2/3 of our health. We also had quite a few lyrium potions, but our mana regeneration was so fast we rarely needed them. The ballistae scattered around did decent damage to the Archdemon, but they would jam, sometimes after only one shot, and repairing them is only possible for rogues. Once they were all jammed, we had no choice but to pick away at the Archdemon with our spells and basic attacks. Unlike a normal dragon, it wasn't immune to fire, but it also wasn't weak to frost. We could only get decent damage on it if our hexes got through its spell resistance, and the hexes wouldn't stick if it moved to another part of the roof, so we only bothered using them if we'd locked the Archdemon down with Paralyze or Petrify first, which rarely worked on it. Once the Archdemon hit about half health, it flew to a section of the roof we couldn't reach, but it could still be hit by ranged attacks and spells, even Cone of Cold and Flame Blast from the right spot, so we were fine. It also started using Spirit Vortex, but that was only an issue if we got swarmed while we were caught in it. Otherwise, it just ruined our visibility and slowed us down, which were minor annoyances at worst. Obviously, we have to deal the final blow. Riordan was slain while grounding the Archdemon, and Alistair is at the city gates, so there's no one else to make the sacrifice. As Alistair gives a more moving eulogy than I thought he would, considering he was not happy about us putting him on the throne, let's go over my thoughts on the run. This was much harder during the early to mid game than it was at the end. I did not realize how overpowered defense could be, or how good Mana Clash was. On that note, I'd recommend getting Arcane Shroud and Mana Clash earlier, although the defense gear or another spell like Heroic Defense or Glyph of Warding might also be needed to push it to the OP heights we reached. Cone of Cold pulled more than its fair share of weight, and Mind Blast saved our backsides a few times too. Life Drain was useful as well, especially early on before we got access to near infinite potions. While Rock Armor wasn't worthwhile, Stone Fist was useful for knockdowns and shatters, Earthquake was situational but very useful when it came up, and I wish we'd gotten Petrify earlier. Flame Blast also did way more damage than I remembered. I suspect I didn't realize how much damage it was doing over time during chaotic full party fights. Spell Wisp was a cheap spell power boost, so it was a good pick, and once we had elemental spells, the hexes were extremely effective. As for spells we could have skipped, I'd say Grease was nice to have but unnecessary. Earthquake did a better job of knocking down groups, and the Grease Fire combo didn't do enough damage to be worthwhile past the early game. We could have skipped the heal spell too, considering how many health potions we had access to. If I'd known to just run to Varathorn and get infinite elf roots, we would have had access to those potions even quicker. I never found a use for combat magic or shapeshifting either, but if I were forced to experiment with them, I'd try shapeshifting to see if the other forms were worthwhile. At the very least, we wouldn't be vulnerable to certain humanoid target-only abilities that were giving us fits like Overwhelm and Grab while shapeshifted, so maybe if we'd invested more in it, then it would have been good against enemies with those abilities. As for spells, I would have liked to try but never got. Obviously, Fireball, Blizzard, or the Shock spells would have been nice to have. The glyphs of Paralysis, Warding, and Repulsion might have been useful too, both for protecting us and disabling enemies. Dispel Magic and Anti-Magic Ward might have been helpful against Uldred and the Fade Beast, since they had nasty spells and couldn't be mana clashed. Crushing Prison would have been good too, but it would have required taking Force Field and telekinetic weapons, neither of which would have been that useful in a solo run. I also would have liked to try Walking Bomb, Death Siphon, Miasma, and Mass Paralysis, but we ran out of spell points. Death Cloud would have been great too, but I don't think it would have been worth taking Death Magic and Curse of Mortality to get it. We had Mana Clash to get rid of enemy healers after all. I think we invested most of our attributes effectively. As I said during the Sloth Demon Fade jaunt, I regret we didn't use those Cunning boosts to get Coercion, because up to 5 points we put in Cunning could have gone to Magic, Willpower, or Constitution. As for skills, I think we could have done without the second rank of Herbalism because our insane magic made the weakest potions very effective, but I'm not sure what we would have taken instead, so I'm not too bothered by it. I'm confident that this challenge could be done on hard without much fuss. If I'd waited a little longer to do those optional proving matches, we would have had higher defense and Mana Clash, and they would have been a breeze on hard. I'm not so sure about Nightmare. The enemies were resisting so many of our spells, and our crowd control effects were noticeably shorter on Nightmare. It almost certainly could be done, but I doubt I'd have the patience to get through it. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the run. If you did, then please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps the channel. I enjoyed revisiting Dragon Age Origins for the first time in years. It held up pretty well outside a couple edgy scenes. I'm planning to do more runs in Origins and Dragon Age 2, and maybe the later games in the series. I haven't played Veilguard at the time of this video's release, and I have mixed feelings towards Inquisition. Maybe I should give it another chance. On that note, I know the Dragon Age series is divisive, and I'm not asking you to agree with my opinions on it, but please keep the discussion civil. You've all been great on the other runs, so I have hope, but if the comments section on this video turns into a dumpster fire, then the odds of there being more Dragon Age content on this channel will drop sharply. With that, I'll see you next time to find out, can you beat Oblivion while always sneaking with no chameleon or invisibility?